Let's go back in time, really back in time. Far, far back in time, so far that it seems almost unimaginable. Let's go back 4.5 billion years. What happened back then? Well, the Earth was formed. And the Earth was formed out of these swirling cosmic gases, and it was really hot. And it took a long, long time for anything interesting to happen. It took hundreds of millions of years before you had water. It took 1 billion years before you had single-celled organisms. It took more billions of years before you had the first bacteria that could create oxygen, and then more billions of years until you got multicellular organisms. It then took another 500 million years after that before we got the very first animals. These were the reptiles, and this is the age of the dinosaurs. It took millions and tens of millions of years after that, 65 million years, before you got to the very first mammals. Now, what's missing over here? Well, where were we? We're not there. We're not even on this list, and we've gone for close to 4.5 billion years. Well, the very, very first remote ancestors of ours, who weren't even Homo sapiens, were the very first hominids who walked upright, and that was still tens of millions of years ago. It wasn't until a few 100,000 years ago that the first Homo erectus and the first Homo sapiens began to come into play, and that's when things began to change. Why? Because they discovered that they could affect their environment. They managed to tame fire. They figured out how to start fires, how to put out fires, and how to use fires to cook and to heat and to do things. At the same time, they were making rudimentary tools. They realized you could take a rock and chip flint to make an arrowhead, that you could make hammers, that you could make very fundamental kinds of tools. We tend to think that things have always existed the way we see them now. The wheel, for example. Oh, must have been back in the beginning of the earth. Well, you know what? The wheel was only invented 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, when you began to have people say, hey, actually they used it first for pottery, but then they put it on carts, and you could actually move things more than a single person could carry. And at that point, they began to communicate with each other, to talk, and to exchange information. And they began to figure out that you could take metal that came out of rocks, and you could do things out of copper. And then you could take another metal, tin, and alloy the two together, and you get bronze. And that lets you make now art and tools and weapons and all kinds of interesting things. And then eventually, 3,000 years ago, from today, we get to the beginning of the Iron Age. And here, with advanced smelting, you could make tools that let you harvest giant fields. You get to have carts on wheels that could go long periods of time. You could get to have all kinds of weapons that allowed for conquest, and empires got built, and you were building cities at that point. And now the first interesting things began to happen. We began to make records of these things. So the first records, the first writing, was cuneiform, scratched on clay. And then you had things scratched on papyrus. And then it took another several thousand years, but not millions and not billions, thousands of years before a guy named Johann Gutenberg invented the method for casting movable type and the first printing press to print from movable type. And that was only 500 years ago. And he figured out how to take knowledge, information, both religious texts and instruction books, and print multiple copies. So the first book from movable type was printed in 1451, the Gutenberg Bible. Think to yourself how many physical books were printed between 1451 and just 49 years later, in 1500, in the first 49 years of printing. Think there were hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands? No, in the first 49 years after Gutenberg, there were 20 million books printed. And this was beginning the spread of information. And when information spread, and we could now share knowledge about how to do things, and knowledge could build on knowledge, that brings us centuries later, hundreds of years later, not thousands, to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And now we figured out how to harness steam, and so you could turn steam and steam engines and move things. You could make machines, and machines could make more cloth than any number of artisans could make by themselves. You take a steam engine and you put it on wheels and on rails, and now you have the railroad, and you can cross a continent in days instead of months or years or centuries. Wow, think about how technology and science is advancing and advancing. It didn't take too much longer after that, 123 years ago, in my grandfather's lifetime, that a couple of bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, took an engine and put it on a bunch of canvas and wood and created the first airplane for human flight. 123 years ago. Sounds like a long time, but within one person's lifetime, within my lifetime, you get to the 1960s, and now we're going out. We've created rockets. We're not just flying 128 feet on a beach in Kitty Hawk. We are actually going to the moon. We land on the moon in 1969, and we know that we can get off this planet and do really exciting things. And one of the things that helped enable this was computers, right? And computers started in the late 1940s. At that point, they were big, room-sized things that didn't have much more power than a 4-function calculator you might have now. But because we could exchange knowledge and we could use these tools to create more tools, developments got faster and faster and faster. Computers went from the size of a room to the size of a desk, to something on your desk, to something you could carry in a bag, to something, an iPhone in your pocket, which is only 18 years ago from today was the iPhone invented. And at the same time, the computers are getting more and more powerful and more small. We're also connecting them. The internet, which started out connecting 3 computers for the Department of Defense, begins to connect everybody in the world. Today, in 2025, there are over 5 billion people who are connected with things in their pocket on a giant global internet. Now, if you think back to the beginning of the Earth and you think about how long the difference was between each of these developments, it seems to be accelerating. Well, that's absolutely true. And the interesting thing about this is that as people, as humans, we are programmed to think in a straight line, linearly. So, for example, if you go 1 step forward and then 1 step up, and 2 steps forward and 2 steps up, what happens? Well, after 30 steps, you'd be 30 steps up. But technology, it turns out, is growing exponentially. And what that means is, instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, it's doubling at every step. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, and up and up and up. And this is something that is challenging for us to think about. Because if you go 30 steps out exponentially, what happens? You don't get to 30, you get to 1 billion. Whoa! A guy named Gordon Moore, who's the president and CEO of Intel, noted in the 1970s that the number of transistor equivalents that Intel could fit onto a single integrated circuit, a single silicon chip, was exactly like this, doubling every 2 years, and the cost was halving. And so computers were getting more and more and more powerful, and you could do things not just do mathematical equations, you could program them to answer questions and so on. And that brings us to AI, artificial intelligence. As we begin to think about what can computers do? Can they actually think like a person? We began to ask them tougher and tougher questions. The first computer that could beat a chess champion happened about 30 years ago. It was a giant IBM's Deep Blue. But then it was only about 15 years ago that the first computer could beat a Jeopardy champion, which required knowledge, human-level knowledge of things in the past. So we have now seen technology advance and advance as these computer chips get ever more powerful. Computers can do more and more things. But at some point, we now have, since for 50 years, the technology has been doubling the number of transistors on a chip since 1975. At some point, we now have 200 billion transistors on one chip, in the latest chip that was released this year. And at some point, if you keep doubling that, you get to a point, if you're a rational person, you say, well, we can't get chips any smaller because atoms aren't that small. How do we keep going with this doubling? Well, the answer is there's something new on the horizon. It's called quantum computing. And this was developed from quantum physics in the early 20th century, and this changes the entire game. Because regular computers work on bits, you all know that, zeros and ones. And quantum computers work on bits as well, but they're called quantum bits or qubits. And these can be 0 or 1, or 0 and 1 at the same time. And if that sounds crazy, it is crazy. Albert Einstein called this the spooky science because it makes no sense. But today, we now have in the labs quantum computers that are using this ability to do unparalleled things in parallel to be much faster than any known computer today can actually be. And while today they are only science experiments in labs, just last month, Microsoft introduced a new quantum computing chip that promises to power computers that can be not 10 times as fast or double or 100 times, but hundreds of thousands of times as fast as these computers. Because now, as we've all seen from ChatGPT and Claude and other kinds of AI large language models, computers are not just answering questions, they are actually creating things. Computers can today write sonnets and sing songs. They can look at video and photographs and text and voice input, and they can give it to you an output. You can converse with generative AI, a computer that is actually generating interesting kinds of new things. And if you think that's wild, well, today computers aren't just sitting either in a cloud or in a machine. Today, computers actually have legs and wheels and arms in robots. And so the very first robots that were used in industrial applications were in specially designed buildings that were designed for robotic things to come pick up packages and so on. What we're seeing today is we're going the other way around. We are developing robots that actually have the ability to interact with the environment the way we as humans see them. So now you can take an existing warehouse, put a robot in there, and it'll roll around, pick up things, and do things better, faster than a person can. And how about taking that into an office? You now have humanoid robots. These are real robots that can go around and pick up something off a shelf and give it to you. It can even go to the break room and make your cappuccino for you and then deliver your cappuccino while it's delivering files out there. And if you think, okay, well, that's a very slow, contrived, clunky kind of thing, well, guess what? Last week, the very first marathon was run with human participants and robots. And the robot didn't beat the human yet. This was in China, a half marathon. But a robot finished that entire course and did it in a couple of hours, still slower than a person. But how long do you think it's going to be before that robotic contestant can beat a real person? And the answer is not very long. But now we have computers that are not just in a box and not just by themselves. We now have computers that are integrated into our bodies. We are now using the building blocks of life with things like CRISPR. We can actually create genes, new variants. We can actually do things that are implants. I had my hip replaced last year. It was replaced by a robot. It was done in an hour and 10 minutes, and I walked out of the hospital with a new hip courtesy of a robot. And what we are seeing now, Neuralink, a company that's working on brain-computer interfaces to implant electrodes in a person's brain, connecting it to a computer. And there are today people who are quadriplegics who are able to write things and move things, move prosthetic arms, just by thinking about it. Imagine what happens when a computer can get into your brain and you can control a computer, or the computer can feed you all the inputs for your brain to control. But it's not just brain-computer interfaces. You put all of these things together when you have the ability to connect directly to a computer, and those computers are powered by these quantum chips, which are millions of times potentially more powerful than our current computers. When you have natural language processing, which lets you talk and interact with a computer as if it were a person. You have robotics and humanoid robots that look, act, sound the same thing, can do anything that a physical person can. You now have the advantage of being able to connect everybody in the world, see everything, how all these giant clouds of data and all these people and robots and computers can connect together within our body and externally. What the heck happens? So Ray Kurzweil is a futurist, is a thinker who's looked at Gordon Moore's law about the doubling of transistors on a chip and said, you know what? That's actually, as you saw from going from fire to the present, been happening about all technology, not just about computer chips. Technology has been doubling in general every 2 years. And Kurzweil predicted that by 2045, which is only 20 years from today, we will have a world in which effectively computers and humans merge, when the next generation of computers will be designing the following generation of computers. And if that sounds crazy, there is a growing feeling today that Ray Kurzweil is too conservative. Most of the CEOs of the major AI companies today believe that that doubling period, now that we've gotten into the world of knowledge and computers instead of physical things, is not 2 years, it's more like 6 months. And what that means is we're now looking at a potential singularity or something like that, general intelligence, within the next 5 years. So it is possible within the next 5 years, we will have super intelligence, more power than every person on the planet together in physical robotic bodies that are more capable than anybody out there. And at the technological singularity, what happens after that? And the answer is nobody has a clue. Absolutely, legitimately, seriously, nobody has a clue because it is so far beyond our imagination, and this is going to be coming within some period from 5 to 20 years from now. And so, could bad things happen? Well, sure, with all that kind of power. But you know what? Good things can happen as well, and that's what I'd like you to focus on. Because imagine the good case if we appropriately guide and align all of this technological development with our humanity and what we're trying to do. We could end up in an extraordinary post-singularity world. We could end up in a world of what Peter Diamandis calls abundance, where we have figured out how to take solar energy and geothermal energy and have continuous, unlimited energy. When we can create things, all of this extraordinary brain power and equipment can make everything for us. It can make food, it can make housing and shelter. It can solve the problems that we've been facing. So imagine no more disease. Imagine solving climate crisis. Imagine what that world could look like in what Reid Hoffman has described as a world of super agency, in which we, together with this superhuman intelligence and technology, can take the best of humanity and spin it out around the world and off our planet to the rest of the universe and create a new world in which we have more compassion, where we have no more wars because everybody has abundance. You're not fighting over scarce resources. Instead, we have the absolute best of humanity amplified by the absolute best in technology to this extraordinary world of the post-singularity. Let's try and get there together. Thank you.